25th October 1978, cinema changed forever when a small independent horror feature was released and the Boogeyman himself was set free upon audiences with a lasting and terrifying effect.
When I think of iconic American slasher movies, I instantly think of John Carpenter's Halloween.
Halloween, directed by 27-year-old John Carpenter, became a trailblazer of horror cinema. Never bettered, but readily imitated.
Here we are 40 years later, talking about Halloween.
Now, as this seminal horror classic prepares for its 40th birthday, we look to some of the film's fans who discuss the impact it has had on their lives, the reason for the film's longevity, as well as exploring the image behind one of horror's most memorable icons, the shape with the blackest eyes, Michael Myers.
Town, and yes, all you monsters and ghouls, it's the eve of Halloween itself here in Russellville. The daylight is slowly going, soon to be replaced by night, and we'll be here all evening to help you out, counting down the horrifying hours to everyone's favourite petrifying day of the year. No, not Christmas, Halloween. Before we kick off the tunes, to get you in the mood, police are reporting a crash just on the outskirts of town. A pretty bad bus crash, I'm hearing. Doesn't say who was in it, who is being carried, and a bit more on the details there, but we'll keep you updated as it's caused a bit of traffic, so stay safe around the A44 as you come into town. But anyway, let's get back to counting down the hours to everyone's favourite day of horror with this spooky track to get you in the mood.
Halloween was only John Carpenter's third feature film. After catching the attention of producer Irwin Yablans with thriller Assault on Precinct 13, they looked to capitalise on the success with another low-budget horror film. Little did they know it would change the face of cinema forever, and the festival of Halloween would soon have a new face and shape.
His filmmaking has single-handedly influenced me as a filmmaker more than any other out there.
John Carpenter is the type of filmmaker that you strive to be.
Indie filmmakers, indie horror filmmakers, I think most of them would tell you that there hasn't been a more influential director than Carpenter.
John Carpenter is definitely a true master of the genre.
I personally can't think of a filmmaker working today that hasn't been inspired in one way or another by one of his films.
John, someone that I love listening to talk about filmmaking. He's one of my favorite directors to really hear him break things down and talk about the genre, talk about the art and the craft.
I have a huge respect for him as a filmmaker and as an artist. I think he's done a hell of a lot for cinema.
His ability to take basically little to no finances and turn that into a really quality movie.
I started to understand the process of making films, and I started to understand what the filmmakers were doing in order to elicit a response from me.
It's just this overwhelming sense that he's very much dueling with the nature of good and evil. And again, that comes through in a lot of his films.
All of his films become classics, and they have their own cult followings.
I've always thought of John Carpenter as much more of a craftsman than an artist. And I would imagine that he probably thinks of himself the same way.
When I think of iconic American slasher movies, I instantly think of John Carpenter's Halloween.
And with Halloween, he pretty much, he broke ground with Halloween. He created like the first like quintessential slasher film.
He did things that people didn't think he could do with a small film.
It's such a simple story, yet he goes about it in such a fashion that it literally becomes like the ultimate suspense thriller.
It made horror for me somewhat respectable in a way, and seeing it handled in the way it was, the material, which is very hokey, it's a man in a mask with a knife killing babysitters. That's it. That's what drew me to it.
The lighting of the film, the way that he kept the shape in the shadows, and it was something that I think at the time with horror films people didn't really have a chance to see. It was new.
He understood that there really isn't anything that he could outrightly show us that would be scarier than what we picture in our own minds.
You don't see much in general. The threat is always there, but it's always very abstract. It's lurking in the dark somewhere. There's a shadow here and there. It's literally just a shape that you feel is somehow present.
With the steady cam shots, Carpenter sort of gives you an idea that you're being watched.
He's very interested in confined spaces. And not just as in like a room, like with four walls. It's confined as in like the town of Haddonfield, for instance, or in The Thing, where they're at the Arctic station.
It's the movie's simplicity that makes it effective. What is more scarier than an escaped mental patient in a small town?
Not gory. It's not even very bloody. Think about it. There's not a lot of blood in Halloween that's shown.
If Halloween had like stationary shots, it probably wouldn't have worked the same. But I think Carpenter knew what he was doing.
He's done things that we're still copying today when we do our own movies.
Because I watched it and it had such a kind of strong effect on me. I was just like, wow, okay, whose is this? And of course, John Carpenter. It was John Carpenter's Halloween, and then John Carpenter's every other film.
Was made by Hawks, didn't he?
Yeah.
It's a good way of branding yourself.
Because if you look at the filmmakers of his generation, the ones making films in the 1970s on low budgets, John Carpenter's films are among the most polished and the most professionally executed.
He loves cinema, lives and breathes it. He knows exactly what the audience wants, and he's the first and last name in genre filmmaking.
Hello? Earl, you fart? Take your Halloween prank shit elsewhere.
The cast was very much a mix of youth and experience for Halloween. On one side you had Charles Cyphers and Donald Pleasance. For the high school trio set to be terrified by the Shape, there was PJ Soles coming off a similar turn in Carrie, Nancy Loomis, and one Jamie Lee Curtis. It was Curtis' first film role, cementing not only the archetype final girl persona, but also initiating what she and others would become known as in the 1980s and beyond, the Scream Queen.
With Halloween, the film's set in suburban America. The teens in peril are not in some abandoned farmhouse somewhere. They're not in a Winnebago out of gas in the middle of nowhere. They're in the same kind of suburban neighborhoods that many of us grew up in.
It made me care about the characters in a way that loads of slashers that came afterwards didn't manage to capture. You know, it was like, fuck Kevin Bacon. I really couldn't care if he died or not. But Jamie Lee Curtis and those other kids, I was generally kind of sad when they got killed.
The fact that we almost follow Laurie for her entire day in the movie is really what allows us to get so close to these characters and care so much about them.
We invest enough time, we spend enough time with these characters to actually care about them, and then when they're put in danger, we are frightened for them.
You like these characters, so when something bad happens to them, you know, it's like, oh, that sucks.
They don't look like teenagers, they look far older, but I think it has to do with the time it was made and in the era of the 70s and the way people dressed, that even today you don't really knock on it.
The three main girls are Laurie, Annie, and Linda. They're very real. They're very real people. Their portrayals are they're kind of your girl next doors. You can relate to them.
Halloween created conventions for horror films that became almost cliche-like in later films. If you have sex, you're gonna die. If you do drugs, you're gonna die. And if you show your boobs, you are going to die. And as a consequence, Michael kills off most of these people to whom these conventions apply. On the other hand, Laurie Strode is bad because she's a virgin, she doesn't drink, and she doesn't do drugs, and thus becomes the epitome of the final girl, basically.
What I loved most about what John Carpenter had done with her character was that while she is a final girl, she's not a perfect character. She has character flaws. She has things that go directly against, the set of final girl rules that kind of came a little later down the pike when it came to slasher films.
No, Jamie Lee Curtis, her performance in that was just groundbreaking.
She is just as important to that series as anybody in the film.
Believable, likable, and played by one hell of an actress, Jamie Lee Curtis.
Originally thought that she was doing such a horrible job that she was expecting to get fired, but Carpenter was really, really happy with her performance.
When we see Laurie running around the neighborhood, pounding on neighbors' doors, begging for help, and being completely ignored, it's scary. It's scary because it's so nightmarish, yet so plausible.
Basically, when the shit hits the fan, and the Shape comes and destroys everything that she holds dear to her, you are really sad, and at the end when she's crying and she's just gone through complete hell, it's really traumatic to kind of watch, and it stays with you for a long time.
When the film starts, you would expect to not have the strength, the guts to battle the killer, when in fact she is she's the one that goes head to head with him, and for the most part, defeats him.
Laurie is the epitome of final girls. Like, she is the ultimate final girl.
In any good horror film, to me, has sort of a lore with it, a good backstory, and I think that without Loomis, you wouldn't have had a good backstory. I mean, the film was already pretty linear and a pretty simple narrative to begin with, but once you start learning about the whole dark legacy of Michael Myers, I mean, you're kind of in this different supernatural world.
Donald Pleasance, I mean, he was the embodiment of the good guy. And I think that's a character that you see a lot in films today.
Dr. Sam Loomis, Donald Pleasance is playing him to a 10, and I absolutely love it. He is chewing the scenery in this movie, and it's exactly what it needs.
He's the voice of exposition. But he still leaves enough mystery to Michael Myers' background to keep things scary.
But the cool thing about Donald is he's got this dynamic where he's both the hero, he's the good guy, but he's also walking this weird balance where he's so creepy himself.
Loomis is almost like this voice of insanity, but at the same time it makes complete sense.
I know they wanted Christopher Lee originally, I believe, and I love Christopher Lee, but I think it would have been a completely different feel, completely different character.
He really takes it upon himself in John McClane fashion to say, look, somebody has to stop this guy. Why is no one doing anything? And he really becomes an unwitting hero. He doesn't maybe necessarily want to do it, but somebody has to do it. And he knows Michael better than anyone else, so obviously who better to take down and become, arch nemesis of Michael Myers than Dr. Loomis.
That's kind of what differentiates Halloween from the likes of Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. To a certain extent, they sometimes have a recurring person who takes on the bad guy, but throughout the Halloween franchise, up until obviously sadly his death, Loomis was almost just as integral to the franchise than the Shape was.
I think since Halloween, we almost expect to see this older, wise character be this kind of harbinger of doom.
Dr. Loomis is the hero. He is, he's the one who knows what Michael Myers truly is.
Jamie Lee Curtis and Donald Pleasence, it really managed to rise above all the other horror films that were coming out at the time.
They say pressure is a good motivator. John Carpenter had the task of composing the soundtrack for Halloween, along with writing and directing the film. After initial rejections from distributors who viewed the movie without a completed score, Carpenter's simple yet sinister theme would eventually become the most famous horror film signature tune of all time. While the Boogeyman himself didn't speak, Halloween's theme added another dimension of terror to the proceedings, giving the infamous madman a metaphorical voice in the tale.
You talk about horror alone, I think it comes down to three. It's Jaws, it's Psycho, and it's Halloween.
Technically, what John Carpenter is doing with the music in Halloween isn't a lot, but what he is doing is perfect.
The guy basically saved Halloween with the score.
One of the most memorable things about Halloween, definitely the score.
I wanted to make synthesizer music because of John Carpenter in that film.
The synthwave scene, for example, owes a lot of debt to John Carpenter. You can hear his creative influence in a lot of tracks, and he is the holy grail of the scene itself.
I don't think you can find a more iconic song than the Halloween theme.
The score to John Carpenter's Halloween is instantly recognizable, and it's probably more iconic than the characters or the film itself.
The distributors weren't really interested in the film until the music was put on. When they watched it without music, it was kind of, and it is, if you turn it on, even though it's visually correct, it probably just didn't have the tension that it needed to have.
Something you could play today, I think, for modern kids, and they probably haven't even seen the film, but they're probably terrified of that sound.
It's simple, but it's insanely creepy at the same time.
All you have to do is hear the first couple of chords of that score, and you can identify it right away.
And the first thing that comes on is that music, and it draws you in immediately, and the pumpkin shows up and so forth. But that music it kind of embeds itself into your skull, and you can't stop hearing it.
When he can kick that theme in, everything starts to elevate.
It's the scariest part of the film.
Something about the way John Carpenter played those tones, just menacing.
We tend to focus so much on the iconic Halloween theme that we forget how amazing and wonderful all the other pieces of music are in the original Halloween.
According to John Carpenter, he scored Halloween in just 3 days. And I think it's probably so effective because when it comes to music, Carpenter is the master of simplicity. And when it comes to horror film scores, the simplest scores are often the most effective and the most memorable.
The music is the film to some degree. Like I don't know if you could have the fear of Michael Myers without that music. That's how important it plays a part in this movie.
One of the most recognizable pieces of music that anybody's ever heard. It not only is the theme to the movie Halloween, it has become like the worldwide recognized theme to the entire season of Halloween.
That was the one song that when it played, you knew to look over your shoulder because Michael Myers was going to be someplace.
Before Jason and Freddy Krueger, there was Michael Myers, the archetypal silent assassin. Menacing, stoic, and downright scary. Carpenter's instruction to friend and part-time actor Nick Castle was to display no emotion. It may seem laughable today, but a William Shatner mask spray-painted white would become the face of horror for 4 decades and counting.
There's no reasoning to it, it's just a man in a white mask, and there's nothing in that mask, and you project all your fears into that mask.
I think the lack of dialogue is what made him so terrifying.
The reason why we are afraid of the dark. People love him for the same reason we love roller coasters, because we like things that scare us.
Michael Myers is the greatest villain of all time. Screw Darth Vader, screw the Terminator. It's this guy right here.
He was the absence of character, the absence of motive, right? You weren't quite sure why he was doing what he was doing, and that was far scarier.
In his monologue about Michael Myers to Sheriff Brackett, Loomis describes that Michael has a blank, pale, emotionless face with the blackest eyes. And if we go with this notion of that the eyes are the windows to the soul, the fact that for the majority of the film, we don't see Myers' eyes. All we see are these black holes where his eyes should be, is basically signifying to the audience that Myers has no soul.
When you see him standing there silhouetted, or when Dean Cundy brings up a light slowly over his face, or when he rises up into frame, forget about it. Absolutely terrifying.
You know this guy's pure evil because your own psychologist is trying to kill you. There's no way back for you. You cannot. All your sessions are done. You're absolutely naffed. Yeah. He's going to shoot you in the head.
He is completely shrouded in mystery.
Myers had like this determination, that he was going to go after anybody that he wanted to go after.
The way he was described in the original draft of the script as the Shape, I mean, that's what he was. He was a form, a former shadow of a human being.
The character of the Shape also reminds me of Yul Brynner from the movie Westworld. How he's just this unstoppable force. He's this killing machine.
In the film, he just keeps coming. And the first thing, or the last thing you're probably going to say is that mask.
The mask in Halloween is extremely important, and it's quite symbolic too. It's very plain, blank-faced, emotionless. It's kind of a void.
It completely strips away any form of identity or any way that you would be able to tell who Michael Myers might be in a crowd of people or standing on your street. And I think that's what makes it so terrifying for audiences, is the fact that it could be anyone and you would be none the wiser.
It's so simple, but when you see that mask, particularly in the right lighting, it's really creepy.
The story goes is that they had two options, and one was, like Willie the Clown, and the other one was Star Trek.
To go, hey, what do you think about this? And we'll paint something up, and then paint another thing, and it's, it's that, and then to come up with the final product being what the shape looks like. That is an incredible accident to have, and it be a icon that will live on forever.
You see such a hideous looking shape, pardon the pun, in the most common of everyday kind of scenarios, so in your neighborhood, outside your bedroom window, in the garden, at your school, all these places that you think are safe, and yet this kind of grotesque looking, yet mute and somewhat sinister figure is invading all these places.
He is a child that has just murdered his sister and is standing on the sidewalk with his parents. And you're left with this opening of, oh my God.
Michael evolves from this small boy who killed his sister on Halloween night into this big, unkillable incarnation of this childhood myth, the Boogeyman. And he's not a rampant freak slasher like Leatherface was or Jason would be afterwards.
Nick Castle and John Carpenter claimed that they really didn't give that much thought behind it. John Carpenter said he just loved how Nick Castle moved. And Nick Castle says he was just moving. Well done, gentlemen, because that is one of the scariest images that's ever been put to film.
The kind of the slow and steady, silent, stalking that he does. I think it's really interesting, though we know the character's name in Halloween, Michael Myers, that again he's referred to in the credits and still today as the Shape.
He's a faceless embodiment of death.
He lurks in the shadows. He really is an unstoppable killing machine.
Carpenter really tapped into what scares us the most, and I think that's not knowing who people are truly, and that's perfectly exemplified with The Shape.
From the way he stood to the way he walked and the tilting of the head and just everything about his demeanor within the confines of the first Halloween film was just absolutely like bone-chilling.
The ever terrifying head tilt as he's listening or thinking about what you're saying or what he's gonna do, and you have no idea what his reaction will be.
There's no reasoning to it. It's just a man in a white mask, and there's nothing in that mask, and you project all your fears into that mask.
To me, a killer seemingly without motive is the most frightening of all, because there's no pattern. He can strike at any time.
What makes Michael so different from all these killers is that he's a very self-controlled killer. He's very subtle even, lurking in the shadows. And he enjoys watching people. He takes pleasure in scaring them before he kills them. And he chooses a very specific moment for his victims to die. If you watch the movie, every one of his victims could have been killed at a much earlier stage in the film, but he waits. He waits until the moment is right for him, and he's taking pleasure in it. He's basically the gourmet of all killers.
And she starts singing the song, I wish I had you all alone, just the two of us. It's like she's calling for him, it's like there's this subconscious desire to have a man, and it's like The Shape picks up on that.
Something that will stop at nothing to get what he's after.
I don't think anybody else, other than Freddy Krueger, can have that kind of stance and be lit like that.
When we finally see Michael Myers unmasked at the end of the movie, he's just some dude. He's just an average guy wearing a mask, but he possesses these supernatural powers.
He is the Boogeyman.
Probably the greatest horror icon that ever hit the screen.
I don't think there's any other character that is actually known for a holiday.
That's why his kind of image has stayed with audiences for so many years. 40 years now we're talking. And yet that image is still effective, even to this day. And regularly every Halloween I put this up in the window and stuff, and it scares the shit out of people when they're walking past. One woman actually fell off the curb one of the years, because she just saw him like in the wind staring at her. So 40 years later, this still has the power to creep everybody out.
Yeah, The Shape, amazing. Next.
Although Carpenter and Deborah Hill thought they'd created a one-off, Hollywood had other ideas, and little did they know Halloween would become one of the most copied films of all time, coining the slasher film genre and a craze that would carry on into the early 80s before dying a death with mixed results. The slasher film was essentially a body count film. But while these films competed for the title of bloodiest, the initial suspense and atmosphere evoked by Halloween has never been recaptured, setting it above the rest.
To me, what became the slasher film started with Halloween.
100%. I don't think we would have the slasher films we have today if it wasn't for, John Carpenter's Halloween.
Halloween really kind of defined the genre.
Halloween has inspired decades of horror movies and calendar-based slashers such as Prom Night, Friday the 13th, April Fool's Day, Happy Birthday to Me,
My Bloody Valentine, Graduation Day, The Burning, The Boogeyman and more.
All of this was developed and put in front of us with Halloween, and I think that's what makes the film so groundbreaking.
So it's kind of ironic that it started the slasher films, but it wasn't the most bloodiest. It kind of didn't start that little bit. All these films kind of added onto this, and additionally added buckets of blood all over the show.
Halloween started this love for horror films, for this slasher genre, and I don't know what it is. I can't explain it. It's just something that I love.
Halloween set up the foundation for what a slasher film should be, but did it inadvertently.
He pretty much, raised the bar and pretty much told future filmmakers, this is what I did with it, now take the ball and run with it.
I don't really consider Halloween 78 to be a slasher film.
I mean, I know it's considered a slasher movie, but for me it's always been this psychological mystery horror because of how important that psychological component is to the overall success of that movie.
It's so scary and horrific, but to me the slasher films are really a little more blood and guts, and there's hardly any blood in Halloween and no guts at all.
A $300,000 movie was now making millions of dollars. All the other production companies were looking at this and saying, well, how can we cash in on that?
Halloween created conventions for horror films that became almost cliche-like in later films. If you have sex, you're gonna die. If you do drugs, you're gonna die. And if you show your boobs, you are going to die.
It seems like people kind of rushed, other filmmakers rushed and went, right, well, we need a serial killer. That woman's really good, she's a final girl, let's use that as something, and if she doesn't have sex, she'll survive, she's a final girl. Everybody who does have sex will bludgeon them in some way. And then kind of miss the point of Halloween in a sense, but it was more about the suspense.
You start with that backstory with the urban legend. You have the guy come back, and he's wearing the mask. He's got the knife, whatever it is, and you've got the final girl.
Every kind of slasher movie after that has, a final girl, there's some element of Laurie Strode in the final girl.
The other slasher films that came after it, while they tried to mimic the success of Halloween, Halloween was not manufactured to be the slasher film.
Halloween was really the one that broke out of the kind of the indie horror or indie scene and really became a sensation.
It was made for very little money, and then it exploded onto the scene, and it really took the cinema by storm.
Now, 40 years later, Halloween's legacy endures, with 10 films to date, while a much-anticipated sequel to the original is about to be unleashed, bringing Carpenter, Curtis and Castle back to the franchise, and a promise to return to the style and unique atmosphere that worked so well in 1978. But what does Halloween mean to today's generation of filmmakers?
It really did change the landscape of horror films for the next 20 years.
It's the combination of the perfect soundtrack, cast, crew, location, story, and it's been copied since day one.
What horror film are you going to watch every year on October 31st? Halloween.
There's something special about Halloween.
To me, that movie is just perfect.
And you're sitting there expecting the shape to jump out, and he doesn't, so you kind of relax as an audience, and then he does jump out when you least expect it. And I remember a few months ago, around last Halloween, there was a public screening of it, and I went to see it, and it was amazing that there were so many young kids who were still jumping at the film.
I see young kids, that are just discovering Halloween, and it's having kind of the same impact on them as it had on me.
I'll never forget this movie, the first time I saw it, and still whenever it plays on TV, regardless if it's June, July, August, January, I have to watch it.
In the horror community, I don't think that you can honestly have a discussion about horror, any type of modern horror, however, whatever you want to discuss within the horror genre without bringing up Halloween.
It's like they say the critics saw Halloween originally and they kind of, oh, that's just exploitation crap, we didn't like it. And then one guy's like, no, this is like Alfred Hitchcock stuff. This is, when you look at that, John was inspired by, Howard Hawks and Orson Welles and Alfred Hitchcock, and you see that in that film. It's just so much more than just a cheap exploitation film.
We're talking about Halloween. We're talking about a movie that is using more of the theater of the mind to scare you, and that's not an easy thing to do.
It's created a legion of horror fans. I know in myself and so many other filmmakers that are a part of this documentary and others.
To this day, including myself, we look at this film and we go, man, we wish we could make this.
It shows you every exercise in suspense and tension,
So its legacy is that so many of us are chasing it. I know I'm chasing Halloween, and I don't want to remake it or copy it, but there's just something so special about it. There's something, and it's 40 years later, we're still obsessed and talking about it.
I don't think Carpenter even knew that the film was going to blow up the way it did.
But now that it's 40 years on, it kind of represents a kind of time capsule in Americana.
I hate to say a movie is perfect, but what do you call it when there's nothing wrong with the movie? So I guess that movie's perfect for me.
It's I think Mark Mold was the one who said it, and I've always agreed with him ever since. The film has a ruthless simplicity about it.
In 1,000 years, it's going to be really interesting to see, even if humans are crawling out of the ashes, I think Halloween is going to still be there.
It very much is going to live on, and I hope it lives on for another 40 years and longer.
And I hope the franchise lives on for years to come.
As far as its legacy, we're sitting here talking about it 40 years later, so I don't think we're going to be not talking about it ever.
After 40 years of terror, it seems that the original Halloween has lost none of its power over audiences. As well as filmmakers who are continuing to carry on its legacy throughout their own work. The enduring figure of Michael Myers simultaneously continues to fascinate as well as horrify. A shapeless entity that preys on us from the shadows, the ultimate trick-or-treater. Always making sure that this Halloween could very well be your last.